Hello my wonderful, beautiful friends, guys. Welcome back to r/MaliciousCompliance, where people follow exact orders to spite someone. And in today's episode, smug, entitled Karen teachers are getting taught lessons by their own students, guys. And one OP tells a story about the time they obey a nasty Karen teacher, and it destroys her career. I hope you enjoy the stories. Hit subscribe if you're not subscribed, and as always, you can send or link your post to this email right here. Let's dive in. There was a girl at my high school who wasn't in my grade, but she was in one of the same classes I took. She had some type of cancer. Now, I don't know the specifics, but she had to have a couple of brain surgeries, leaving giant scars all over her head. She lost all the hair from the medications as well. She just wanted to experience high school like everyone else when she felt well enough to go. I remember her being so excited, telling us that she was going wig shopping one weekend. On Monday, she walks into homeroom with some big, bright Dolly Parton hair. She looked awesome, and you could tell she felt good too, which is what mattered to us. We were all supportive, and we made her feel like $1,000,000. But the teacher wasn't having it. Our homeroom teacher was notorious for being harsh, and she told her to remove the wig. The girl tried to explain, and we all tried to explain as much as possible without getting too into her business. But the teacher wouldn't listen, and she demanded she take it off, not hearing us at all try to explain the cancer situation. We were all mad for her, but the girl just smiles. She takes the wig off, and she sat back ready for class. And you should have seen the look on the teacher's face. I think the girl even said something along the lines of, "I don't want to distract my classmates with my new hair, I'm sorry." The teacher couldn't focus. She kept losing her place and staring at her. The giant bright red scars on the girl's head. Wig or not, we thought she was beautiful anyways. Most of us went to the principal before the bell even rang. The teacher had to issue an apology in front of the class, and she even tried to save face by saying that the girl was exempt from the rule. What rule, we never found out. The girl just smiled and said, "But I don't want to distract my classmates," in response. The teacher left after a month, and we never saw her again. Some frickin' teachers, right? I just don't get how she made such a big deal over a wig, and how was she not made aware of the cancer situation? Or worse, was she aware and she just chose to put that student on the spot anyways? And seriously, you gotta love the fact that she tried to save face by saying, "Okay, only she's exempt from the rule." That said though, the fact that her classmates all supported her Dolly Parton wig and made her feel awesome, that's the kind of stuff we need more of in this world. And this person shares a wholesome story where a teacher wasn't so nasty. So this happened years ago when I was in high school, but I smile every time I think of it. My high school had this policy that anyone who's missed less than a certain number of school days could pick one class they had an A in to skip the final. It was an awesome policy, and we all loved it. One year, we had this kid who had been diagnosed with cancer. He spent a lot of his year sick, getting treatment, going to the hospital, etc., etc. Despite all of this, he finishes the year with an A in Spanish class. It was his only high school class, so it was the only final he would have been able to skip. But here's the thing. Administration was not going to let him skip the final because he missed too much school. He and his parents asked to make an exception, given the situation, but administration wouldn't budge. His teacher stood up for him, but she was told that this kid had to take the final no matter what. He had missed too many days, and there would be no exception. So the teacher says okay, but told her whole class not to study for, worry about, or exempt her final. The day the students show up for the final, she tells them to take out a piece of paper and number it from 1 to 3, leaving a line between each number. She then said, "Your exam's about to begin." She then asked 3 questions. Number 1, what's your name? Number 2, how do you say yes in Spanish? And number 3, how do you say hello in Spanish? She then collected the final, and everyone got 100 that year, and she became a legend. The kid's been cancer-free for over 5 years now. So this is a story from back when I was a sophomore in high school, and it's about one of the worst teachers I've ever had. Well, it's actually about my second or third worst teacher. So hard to choose, but definitely my most malicious example of compliance as a teenager. Here's some background information. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, and I attended a school that was surrounded by cornfields on 3 sides. The district was so sparsely populated that my entire graduating class was only 48 students, and the local economy was mainly based on farming and steadily disappearing factories, so the residents weren't very wealthy. The combination of these two things meant the school didn't receive much funding, which in turn meant that it had a lot of trouble attracting and retaining high-quality teachers. The majority of teachers were either new graduates looking for experience before moving on to higher-paying jobs, or the borderline incompetent ones who were transferred from other districts because they couldn't be fired due to tenure. Despite looking gothy at the time, I always did well in school, and I focused hard on my studies, as my big dream was to move out of the small town to the big city and go to college. I made some money on the side by tutoring other students, and this will be relevant later. My friend Lisa, who is also a strong student, has a small part in the story, and let's call the nasty teacher in question Miss P. I mentioned above that many teachers were either inexperienced or lazy, but Miss P managed to be both. She was originally hired as the elementary school nurse, but then the sophomore chem teacher quit the last minute, and the administrators figured, well, Miss P taught 1 semester of 4th grade science, so she'll be a good chemistry teacher, right? Spoiler alert, she wasn't. It would be a stretch to say that Miss P actually taught chemistry. She just read out of the teacher's edition of the textbook and distributed worksheets, and she dodged a lot of student questions because she didn't know her hydrocarbons from a hole in the ground. Not that people asked very many questions once it became clear that they probably knew more about the subject than she did, which she was perfectly content with. Anyways, one day, Miss P was droning on about ionic bonds while I was sitting in the back of the classroom near the lab stations. I was talking quietly with my friend Lisa about something unrelated to class because we'd already taught ourselves the material. Miss P notices us, however, and she calls us out on it. She screams and says, "You two, why are you talking in my class?" Note the wording, because there wouldn't be a story to tell if she said stop talking in class, but she went for the rhetorical question. I was more direct than tactful at that age, which led to the first minor malicious compliance. I respond, "It's because we, Lisa and I, already know this." Cue some snickering from the other students. Miss P definitely didn't appreciate my blunt honesty, especially since it addressed the elephant in the room, her lack of teaching skills. Now, she could have easily salvaged the situation for herself by giving me detention for talking in class, or even saying, well, pay attention anyways, but instead, Miss P says, "Oh, if you already know everything I'm teaching, then how would you like to teach today's class?" I'm sure you can see where this is going. Thus begins my malicious compliance. I respond, "Okay," and I did. The snickering intensifies as I proceed to walk to the front of the classroom, and to Miss P's surprise and displeasure, I taught a passable lesson on ionic bonding for the first half hour or so of the class. The details are fuzzy now, but I remember drawing on the blackboard to visually show how the total number of charges need to balance, doing examples that weren't taught in the teacher's edition, and making it easier to understand than how she taught it. I'm sure I was awkward and disorganized at points, but I was a 16-year-old with no time to prepare. I didn't think about it at the time, but in retrospect, I'm sure Miss P was listening for any opportunity to correct a mistake or otherwise put me in my place. Apparently, she didn't find any. I was about to continue to the next part of the lesson when Miss P just stops me as I was stealing her thunder. She told me to go sit down, and she proceeds to show a video of the topic we were learning for the rest of the class. A few people did tell me in the hallway afterwards that my lesson was a lot clearer than any of Miss P's had been. And let me be perfectly clear here, that's a very low bar. To any high schoolers reading this, I'm sure you could teach a better class than Miss P. She never addressed what happened, but she did let me talk with my friends in class for the rest of the year. Her contract wasn't renewed after that year, which probably had nothing to do with me, as her position was a stopgap to begin with. The following year, we had a new teacher named Miss M, who was thankfully friendly, motivated, and competent. She spent most of the first semester of Chemistry 2 doing remedial work to teach everyone what they should have learned in Chemistry 1. She then left the next year to take a better paying job in a larger district, but so it goes. Good on OP for showing that incompetent teacher how it's done. But honestly, what do you expect, right? Like OP said that she was originally an elementary school nurse who was essentially forced into a teaching job after teaching elementary science one time. So you can't really fault her for not completely knowing the material. And here's the thing, if that teacher was as smart as she was lazy and inexperienced, she would have gotten OP to teach that class. Work smart, not hard, they say. And this person shares their comment about a useless teacher, and they say, I had a physics teacher in college that was just awful. She was new to teaching, and she was trying some new methods, such as having the students read sections of the textbook and then teach the sections to the rest of the class. And if somebody didn't understand it, well, too bad, she was moving on to the next section. She was also a practicer of what I think she called Socratic teaching, where if you asked her a question, she would ask you questions, and then try to lead you to the answer that way. And you can imagine how that went with a room of college kids that just wanted an answer to their question. The effect it had was that no one would ask her questions, and they would just find an answer another way. I think something like half the class was failing by the time final exams came around. I think she was forced to offer an extra credit project, but the assignment she gave us was next to impossible to finish with just a couple of weeks left in the semester, 1 week of which was finals, so no one did that extra credit. Over half the class failed, and she was no longer at the school after that semester. I know that every student in my class tore into her when it was time for reviews. The school really should have just written it off for us and not put the fail on our transcript and not charged us for it. But we still had to take physics again. If I had been more confident back then, I definitely would have fought them on it. For some context, this was pre-2020, back in my early university years. It started one Wednesday morning when I woke up feeling like complete and utter crap. This was a problem, as today I was scheduled to do my oral presentation, along with other students in one of my classes. But I figured there's no way I would be wanted to come in sick. And by sick, when I looked in that mirror, I was so pale and I looked dead. My eyes were so sunken in that they were in the back of my head, and I was sweating like hell from a high fever. Oh, and my throat felt like it was made of sandpaper, so yeah, there was no way that I was going into the lecture hall looking like this. So I went through the normal procedures, submitting a temporary absence form, which meant that for the absence to be valid, I needed to go to a walk-in clinic and call any professors or teachers' assistants to inform them of my absence, along with an email for a paper trail. Now, all of my teachers understood. However, my morning chemistry professor wasn't understanding. She said to me, either you stop lying and come in, or it's an automatic 0. So I thought, okay, fine then. I get up and my mom drives me as I don't have a license yet. She's worried about me, but I reassure her that I would only be about 20 minutes max. I get to campus and walk in, and heading to my lecture hall, I look like utter crap, stumbling because I'm also running a really high fever. I got a lot of weird looks, and some students even stopped me to ask if I was okay. I recall responding with something like, I won't be okay if I'm late for class. When I get to my lecture hall, I enter 2 minutes late. Professor sees me, and she goes, "Oh, P, it's about time. Get down here and start your presentation, or it's a fail." And I thought to myself, alrighty. So I went up and plugged in my laptop to the projector. And that's when I released an almighty round of wet coughing. It's at this point my lecture mates are whispering to each other, and Professor looks at me all startled. But all I remember doing is looking right at the professor, smiling, and saying very hoarsely, "I'm sorry, I'll get started." She quickly tried to send me on my way, but I say into the microphone, my voice sounding like a sick bear's, No, you said if I don't present, it's a 0. And I can't fail 20% of my grade. I can't afford it." So off I go, presenting with a hoarse voice, long hacking wet coughs, and with the occasional almost vomiting. When I finish, I then turned to the professor and I asked again into the mic, "Do you need me to stick around for the other presentations, or can I go?" I was on my way to the doctor's within 5 minutes. And wouldn't you know, I had a serious case of the flu, something that the university did not want you to bring to campus because it could spread like wildfire. Needless to say, when I filed my full absence form with my doctor's note, I mentioned about how my chemistry professor insisted upon me coming to class. I also include a screenshot of the email she sent me while I was being driven in, which stated the same thing she told me over the phone. When I was able to return to campus a week later, I was surprised to enter the class to see a substitute professor. I later looked at my email, and I saw a class notification that our professor was placed on leave. She was let go by the end of the term. Guys, I find it so funny how some people don't realize what they're doing as they dig their own grave. And I'm willing to bet this wasn't her first time doing this type of thing to a student, but it might have been the final straw that broke the camel's back. And seriously, this is why reporting and always giving a paper trail of bad professors is so important, because you never know what the outcome will be. And this person shares their similar experience, and they comment, "This happened to me while I was in elementary school. Our math teacher really hated my guts for no real reason, really. I was a pretty sick kid that had bad asthma, dermatitis, and I was sickish in general. Thinking back, I think her hating me had a lot to do with that, as she felt I had special treatment and privileges. One day, we were doing a test, and I start feeling really bad. It came to the point of really needing to puke, but I held it in because I knew she wouldn't believe me. Then I start shaking and I kind of puked a bit in my mouth. So I stood up and start walking towards the toilet. She of course stopped me and she told me to go sit back down. I tried explaining, but she wouldn't have it. That's when one girl stood up for me and she said something like, "Hey, he's really pale and he's shaking and sweating. I think he needs to go home." Well, that caused the teacher to go on a 5-minute rant. How I'm a spoiled liar who didn't study for the test, and now I'm trying to fool everyone, and that I'm taking away their precious test time, and that they should hate me for that. I said I really need to puke, and she just scoffed saying, "You ain't going anywhere with your lies, so you might as well do your imaginary puking right here." Well, you can guess what happened next. I'm not sure if this is compliance because I couldn't hold it in anymore, but I was happy while doing it. First, I puked a bit through my arm, and then it all came out. It went across her desk and all over the floor. She then tried to blame me, saying that I threw up by force, but the principal didn't buy it after the doctor examined me. Luckily, all the kids backed me up and she was reprimanded. And for the rest of the school year, she basically ignored me. She never bothered me again. So I was a one-man army against the school policy at my school. A lot of the policy was harmful towards poorer students and just didn't make any sense, and my spectrum brain couldn't handle the stupidity. I recently recalled this story of a battle between me and one of the bully teachers at the school. One time, I didn't want to go to school because my shoes had holes in them. My mom let me wear my trainers and she sent me to school with a note, but she had bad handwriting, so they thought I faked it. One of the teachers starts quoting the dress code at me and he threw away my note when I gave it to them. They then brought some ratty shoes from the lost and found, and they tried to make me wear them, so I straight up told them to F off. Well, it pisses the teacher off, so he tries to grab my foot and force a shoe on. So I screamed, "Sir, stop inappropriately touching me." And while the other students found it hilarious, he didn't, so I got an in-school suspension. That teacher ran the isolation wing, so I end up going and sitting in his room with him and some others. But the ridiculousness of the whole thing just made me mad. Him throwing away my notes and grabbing my foot made me fully convinced that he didn't give a crap about the policy he was enforcing, so why should I? So I start swinging in my chair and singing loudly, and he told me to stop, so I tell him to F off. He then asked if I want to be sent home, so I said, no crap, I want to be sent home, that's where all my games and fun stuff were. He then said I was there to learn the rules, so sit down and shut up. And I said if I was in there for breaking the rules, why the F would I follow them now? He then said that kind of talk would end up putting me in prison. So I respond, so would forcefully touching students. And that was the last straw. He sent me home for the day. I then spent the day brushing up on school policy. Well, it turns out for a uniform violation, you're supposed to get a warning. So the next day, I come back wearing the wrong sweater, and he yelled at me. I show him the policy, and he warned me, and he said he didn't want to see anything that wasn't school uniform. So I came back the next day wearing different trousers. The teacher yelled at me again, so naturally, I asked him to be specific about what he wanted me to wear. He said if it was in the school policy, I could wear it. So I thought, great. I start coming in gym clothes and trainers, the same trainers from before. It turns out there's a whole separate uniform for gym days, and most people change on the day. But there is no rule that says that you have to or that you can't wear the uniform on other days. He then tried to take me to see the head teacher when he saw me, thinking it was grounds for expulsion. So the head teacher asked why I wasn't complying. I said I was simply confused about the policy. The headmaster took some time to explain it to me while I patiently waited for him to finish. And then I innocently inquired as to what the school policy was around destruction of personal property or touching other students below the belt. Apparently, it's absolutely not allowed. Not even a note. So I asked if the same rules applied to teachers. It did. So I then turn around and ask the other teacher, so why did you put your hands on me to try to physically force me to change? And why did you destroy my note? Hearing me say that, the headmaster looks at the teacher, and the teacher looked at me, then him, then me. Headmaster then asked for the room, so I step outside. I don't really know what was said, but there was about 10 minutes of yelling, and then I was invited back inside. The headmaster asked for the full story, so I gave it to him, including my insubordination, etc. And the whole time, the headmaster was shooting daggers at the other teacher. It turns out, the other teacher didn't have as much authority as he claimed he did. When he sent students home, he had been altering their files to mark them as absent for the day, and he had been going behind the headmaster's back to dole out extra punishments. No one else had questioned his authority before because he was a bit of a bully, and I'd been the first one stubborn enough to call him on his BS. He didn't get fired, but he did get some kind of formal warning, and I was allowed to keep wearing gym clothes as a special exception on mental health grounds. Looking back, I'm fairly confident that it was a bribe, so we wouldn't sue or report the teacher. You know what, OP did sound like a pain in the ass student, but that's exactly what that teacher needed, right? And I'm honestly surprised the teacher didn't get reprimanded because in my opinion, and I'm sure many of you will agree with, is that teachers should never aggressively put their hands on any student, and trying to force a shoe onto a kid's foot is highly inappropriate. I'm just glad he got knocked off his high horse. And guys, speaking of people getting knocked off their high horse, this last Karen teacher gets taught a lesson by the whole class. So I was listening to some stories, and I was immediately brought back to my senior year of high school. I went to a Catholic school, and we took a religion course every year. Our teacher, who we'll call Mrs. P, was the absolute worst. She was a brand new teacher, extremely strict, and she basically hated anyone who wasn't extremely Catholic. Every morning, we had morning prayer, Pledge of Allegiance, and announcements before the official start of class. Mrs. P would on purpose close the classroom doors and lock them, so anyone who came in after prayer started would have to stand in the hallway until morning announcements are over. On this particular morning, my friend Brian was speaking to a teacher before first period. He made it right at the bell, but Mrs. P had already locked the doors. Prayer begins, and one of our classmates snuck over to the door to let Brian in. We thought all was well until announcements end, and Mrs. P starts screaming at us to tell her who was late. None of us say a peep because snitches get stitches. At that, Mrs. P gets angrier and she screams, "If you don't tell me who walked in during prayer, you will all go get late slips from the principal." At that, the entire class, about 20 kids, look at each other, and they decide to comply with Mrs. P. We all walk downstairs into the lobby of our school, where the principal and the vice principal's offices were. Our vice principal takes one look at us, and he says, "What the hell are you all doing here?" We told him Mrs. P sent all of us there to get late slips, because we let Brian in during prayer, and Mrs. P considers that late. None of us wanted to snitch, plus Brian was on time to school, and he would have been in the classroom had Mrs. P not locked the doors before the bell. Hearing that, he just paused and he looks at all of us for a bit. He then chuckles and says, "Get back to class." Needless to say, that was Mrs. P's first and last year of teaching there. And that, my friends, brings us to another end of r/malicious compliance. Guys, I hope you enjoyed today's stories. If you did, hit that thumbs up, and if you're not subscribed, consider subscribing so you don't miss these crazy stories. And if you missed yesterday's episode on the channel, it's an r/I don't work here lady, where a psycho Karen boss thinks OP's an employee and fires him, and it's the worst mistake of her life. Guys, go check it out if you haven't, and myself and Stevie Boy will see you guys in the next one. We love you.